Well, good morning and welcome along to the North Lodge Cottage Garden. I, as always, am the gardener Ben, and you find me this morning up in our little wildflower meadow with a second live on the subject of organic pest control, soil conditioning, and how you can use different techniques in the garden. I'm just going to move the camera ever so slightly for you. And you can use different techniques in the garden to control pests and diseases, and I would like to talk to you this morning about No Mow May. And this camera angle is not working very well, is it? Right, bear with me a second. Every time I move my head. Right, anyway, let's lean forward and we'll do it that way. No Mow May here in the UK has become a really hot topic of people thinking that they are doing the right thing with regards to bringing and encouraging wildlife into their garden. And I would never ever suggest that anybody doesn't do No Mow May here in the UK. It is a really good way of shining the spotlight on some of the environmental issues that we are suffering, not just here in the British Isles, but also across the world. The UK is one of the largest affected nations on the planet. I believe around 70% of our natural nature species are already at risk and in decline. We have lost a staggering 65% of all of our biodiversity in the last 30 years. Due to overpopulation, due to climate change, due to intensive farming and development of our environment. A lot of the species that we take for granted here in the UK, a lot of our woodland creatures, for instance hedgehogs, are in a rather massive threat from actual extinction, and we really do have to make a huge change. And as gardeners, being the caretakers of a lot of the natural space, we need to change the way that we think with regards to the spaces that we approach. I said in a recent live video here on YouTube and over on Instagram that I don't ever really consider myself to be the owner of my garden. I'm more of the caretaker here. Now, we're very lucky. I've explained on several occasions we made huge sacrifices with regards to buying this house. I know everybody did, but we didn't actually buy a house. We bought a plot and a property on a plot, and we suffered the consequences of that house as a result. A lot of people wouldn't have made the decisions we made based on the actual plot size. We wanted as much land for our money as we could possibly buy, and the house that we bought was completely insignificant. As long as we could fit in it and remain warm and dry, we didn't really care. For me, it was the actual plot, and we have 2,200 square meters of plot surrounding our house. And No Mow May is a really good way of throwing the spotlight onto issues in the garden. And so many people bat the term around thinking they're helping the environment and they're helping wildlife and they're helping nature by setting aside their lawn and sitting and looking at it grow through the month of May. For 31 days they leave it alone, and then on the 1st of June they go outside with their strum and they go outside with their mower and they attack it, and they basically kill everything that gravitated towards that spot, which for me as a gardener and for me as someone who is very interested in the environment and nature is a huge no-no as far as I'm concerned. So what I'd like you to do is, if you're considering doing No Mow May as a way of helping the natural environment and encouraging huge amounts of wildlife into your garden, I would really like you to consider not setting aside so much of your garden for No Mow May, not all of your lawn for instance, and not mowing it, but maybe setting aside maybe 10% of your property and just leaving it completely alone. Now, whether you garden on a balcony, a terrace, or like me, you have a large garden, 10% is a huge amount of space that you can actually add up. The meadow that I'm sat in at the moment, I'm going to turn the camera, you're going to get a glint on the sun again. The meadow up here at North Lodge is actually 150 square meters. As a gardener, I have decided to completely and utterly set aside, and I'll tell you how I manage it. Most meadows have to be trimmed or cut or topped, as they call them, twice a year. I don't feel particularly comfortable with that, again, because of the fact that we have a space we've asked nature to gravitate towards. The rest of the garden is fairly well manicured, although I'm very proud of the habitat we've set up all over the garden. We have obviously a huge amount of other wildlife visit us. The wildflower meadow up here is completely nature's. It's not mine at all. I'd avoid the topping of the meadow in late April and early May. I'd leave that alone at the detrimental effect of a lot of the biodiversity of the flowers, which means I have to work really, really hard at the very end of the season, making sure that a lot of the flower species are brought back into the meadow. I don't actually trim it at all or mow it in late August or September like you would do a large field of wildflowers. You've all seen those videos on Instagram, on YouTube, on the internet, on nature programs of creatures basically running in front of mowers and strimmers and tractors, taking their young with them as the meadow that they have inhabited for a period of time is then cut down, which for me, again, I don't feel comfortable with. I did trim this meadow about 2.5 years ago at the end of the season, and I killed several frogs, and for me I thought that was completely unnecessary. So this meadow I actually cut on my hands and knees, and that sounds very bizarre, but I get down with a pair of sheep shears on a mat, I cut it and I allow all the clippings to fall to the floor, where I leave them for around 7 to 10 days before raking them up and taking them away. In the leaving of the seed and the leaving of the dead matter on the surface of the soil for about 7 to 10 days, you actually end up with a natural seed bank going back into your meadow or your area that you've actually allowed to stand. So I'm going to ask you, if you do intend to bring nature into your garden and you really want to make a physical positive change to the nature in your garden, I'm going to ask you to simply set aside 10% of whatever growing space that you have in your garden. If you have a balcony or a terrace, that can just be a couple of pots that you don't weed, you don't overly tend, you don't apply any fertilizers, organic or otherwise. You just leave it alone for nature to gravitate towards. And if, like me, you have a garden, you can set aside 10% of it that you don't actually use, you don't actually have to touch whatsoever. You'll be really, really surprised by the amount of things that gravitate towards it. And if you do decide to do No Mow May, and you can't set aside 10% of your garden, do consider attacking the renaturalization of that area in a different way at the end of May. Now, obviously, the reason why it doesn't sit very well with me is obviously we're asking nature to gravitate towards an area. It's like taking yourself to an all-you-can-eat international buffet and thinking, oh my goodness, this is great. I can have whatever I want, I can eat whatever I want. And then all of a sudden on the 31st of May, that is over, and someone's going to come attack you with a strimmer and a lawnmower, and you're going to take away all that habitat, which for me is not particularly comfortable. If you do have to then cut your lawn after the end of May, I'm going to ask you to do end of May. I'm going to ask you to do one of several different things. You can approach it in several different ways. One, don't cut all of your space at once. Cut 50% of it and leave the other 50% for several weeks for everything to gravitate towards a space, and then it can actually move off into different parts of the natural environment around you. If you do have to cut it, please do cut it towards the back end of the day when the temperatures have warmed up and everything is mobile and moving. Here up in the wildflower meadow, I'm very, very proud that over a period of a couple of years, we have acquired some slow worms, and here in the UK they are incredibly rare, and if you do end up with slow worms in your garden, chef's kiss to you, because they are incredibly beautiful creatures that are under huge threat here in the UK. They need to be warm to be able to move around, and if you decide to trim or mow your grass very, very early on in the day, especially if you've left it standing for 31 days during the month of May, you're going to end up with an awful lot of creatures that don't move particularly well under cold conditions. Things like frogs and newts will gravitate towards long and wet grass, and they'll get trimmed or mowed. They won't be able to get out of the way quick enough. So if you can leave it towards the end of the day when it's dry, it will be much, much easier for you to cut. Your lawnmower and trimmer won't clog up with wet grass, and you're giving those creatures that need the warmth of the sun enough heat to be able to move off. The other thing you can do is, if you're lucky enough to have a backpack blower or a hand blower, you can actually just blow the area down, agitate the grass and make quite a lot of noise, and make sure that you're giving the creatures a bit of an announcement that you're on your way with whatever piece of machinery that you've got. Move the grass around, maybe send the children in with some sticks, and I'm not saying they should beat animals, I'm not saying that at all, but what I am saying is they can go into that area, they can bang the grass with the sticks or a rake, make lots and lots of noise. All the creatures that have been using that area will actually say, oh, I don't like this is different to what it's been, and they will naturally move off. They'll take flight, or they'll move away from the area. So that's one of the things that you can do. So you can either leave the area right to the back end of the day until it's warm. You can consider only cutting half of it in 1 week and then leaving it for several weeks and cutting the other half at a very different time, maybe slightly towards the end of June, or maybe leave 10 or 15% of it completely as a harbour. But I say I don't feel particularly comfortable with this culture that people are batting around at saying, oh, I do no mow, it's great for the environment. Well, actually all you're doing is you're giving nature somewhere to go, harbouring it into this one area in your garden, and then attacking it with a strimmer or lawnmower and basically decimating entire populations. And when you're talking about frogs, and we're talking about newts that are maybe gravitating towards that, with life cycles that take between 3 and 4 years to repopulate, that kind of behaviour can be absolutely catastrophic, especially if you, like me, are lucky enough to have acquired some slow worms. I really couldn't bear that. So this area up in the wildflower meadow is completely set aside, and if you do decide to set aside around 10% of your garden like we have done here, I'm going to ask you also to start considering underplanting it with a serious amount of bulbs. One of the largest threats that's threatening pollinators here in the UK and across the world due to climate change is our seasons have become so polarised. We now don't really have 4 seasons here in the UK. We now have a very cold and wet winter where we receive around 9 months of our rainfall in one go, meaning the soil is sopping wet all through the summer, all through the winter. We then have these blazingly hot summers with temperatures in excess of 30 to 35 degrees, which I know in a lot of places of the world is very, very normal. But here in the UK, that's very, very abnormal. And last year we went up to 9 weeks without any rain whatsoever, which is a huge amount of time for us here. So I'm going to ask you to just turn the mirror ever so slightly and look at underplanting any space that you have set aside with a lot more plants to enable pollinators to actually fly and actually gain a meal. The springs here have become much, much milder, but there's nothing out there for a pollinator to eat, so they're taking flight often in January, February, March and the very beginning of April. It's 4 degrees here this morning. It's very, very cold indeed, and there's very little in flower. So if you can underplant any spaces that you're setting aside for nature with any of the following, you really, really help elongate the flowering season of the area, making it very, very interesting, but also making sure that any pollinators that are taking flight, bumblebees and solitary bees, are particularly at risk from this. The area that the air warms up, they think, oh, it's spring, I'll go out of my burrow and I'll start foraging about. They haven't got the food stores backed up to be able to, one, feed themselves, and secondly, start a brood of larvae, and they actually make the situation worse. They take flight and end up exhausted, cold, and end up dying because they can't find anything to eat. So if you can underplant your spaces with any of the following, snowdrops are a really, really good and very, very early source of nectar and pollen from many flying, especially solitary bees and solitary insects. So a really, really good one. This area is underplanted with hundreds and hundreds of crocus. Now I'm not going to specifically say, I mean, they're Dutch and they're species crocus, so it doesn't really particularly matter, but a really, really good source of nectar and pollen for especially bumblebees. Absolutely love crocuses. Then daffodils, and I know there's hundreds and hundreds of different varieties of daffodils that you can actually choose to plant. Plant as many different types as you can is the advice from myself. This area is underplanted with hundreds of tete-a-tetes. They flower very, very early on in the season. They're in bloom in late January and very early February. They're then followed up by Jetfire, which is one with a little orange trumpet. They have then Bionicle, which is a double tete-a-tete in flower. And now we're entering, if I turn the camera again, you can see we're entering the stage where we've got white daffodils. So Thalia and Trezomble are underplanted in this particular meadow, elongating the flowering season even more. We've then got tulips, which are particularly useless to most pollinating insects, but they're pretty enough and they will do something. Then hundreds and hundreds of alliums, and it's this very important gap that we're talking about as we approach April and into the very, very beginning of May, which us beekeepers, I'll turn the camera once again, you'll see my beehive just over in the corner there is actually empty at the moment, but I work very hard as a gardener on what we call the hunger gap, and that occurs in late April and the very beginning of May, when the temperatures are warm and there's not a huge amount in the garden. The herbaceous perennials, which we are all famed for, especially here in the North Lodge Cottage Garden, huge amount of planting, masses of exuberant, opulent herbaceous perennials. There's not really a great deal in flower, which is why alliums are so important to be planting. All of the flying insects, hoverflies, pollinating wasps, bees and honeybees absolutely adore alliums, and planting them in very large quantities in the garden will really help. So those are things that you can plant towards the front end of the season. Then consider planting things like wallflowers, which here in the UK have gone very much out of fashion. I'm very much a huge fan of the wallflowers, absolutely adored by bees and pollinators. And then towards the back end of the season, you're looking at underplanting with things like Michaelmas daisies, asters to elongate the season. Also things like penstemon are very good, and cyclamen making up a very late crop of pollinating insects right into the back end of September into October and even the very beginning of November. Anyway, so what I wanted to do by joining you live this morning is just to give you my thoughts on No Mow May, and in no way whatsoever to not encourage people to do No Mow May, but to just slightly turn the mirror, have a look at it from my point of view and think, actually what I've done is I've set aside an area of my garden. I've asked all of the nature locally to gravitate towards my lawn where it's going to enjoy 31 days. And then I'm going to attack it with a strimmer or a lawnmower. I'm going to cut it down and I'm going to take it away. And for me, that is not good enough. You want to be leaving that area standing, or consider just basically allowing nature into your garden. Give it 10% of your actual space. And I know it's a really big ask, but we can all find an area, whether it's behind a shed, down the side of our allotment, maybe on the front verge of our house. Maybe we don't want to cut the front garden. We just want to leave it for the year and just let it go. And you'll be absolutely amazed and surprised by the nature that gravitates towards that space and the benefit you can do to your natural natural wildlife and local area. Anyway, if you've got any queries or questions, please don't hesitate to drop me a comment below. I do many more of these live events over on my Instagram page. You can find me using all of the major platforms, using the same handle at @_gardener Ben. For those of you who are local here in the UK, feel free to pop along to Wisley, RHS Wisley, this coming Saturday at 2 p.m, where I'll be speaking on behalf of the Bearded Iris Association, talking about bearded irises and the use in the modern cottage garden. Thank you for joining me this morning. I will hopefully see all of you again soon. Take care now. Bye-bye.